The phone in the break room rang at 4 in the morning, and on the other end was a voice Walter Boyd had not heard in 11 years, telling him not to come to work the next Friday, to wear something clean, and to leave the back door of the maintenance shed unlocked. Walter held the receiver against his ear and said nothing, because the voice belonged to a man he had buried in his memory, along with a stretch of highway and a tire iron, and a night he had told no one about. The man on the line did not explain. He only said that something was owed, and that it was time, and that Walter should not argue. Then the line went dead, and Walter stood in the dark of the break room with the mop bucket cooling beside him and his own heartbeat loud in his ears. He did not sleep that week. To understand why a janitor lay awake over a 4-minute phone call, you have to go back to a stretch of 2-lane road outside a town called Hollis Junction, where the asphalt buckled in the heat and the cell signal died for 9 miles in either direction. Walter had been 61 then, though everyone took him for older, because a life of concrete floors and night shifts had bent his shoulders and grayed him early. He drove a rust-eaten pickup with a tape deck that ate cassettes, and he drove it slow, the way men drive when they have nowhere they are needed, and all the time in the world to get there. That was the kind of man Walter was. The kind nobody waited up for. It was past midnight when his headlights found the shape on the shoulder. A motorcycle leaned at a bad angle against the guardrail, and a man crouched beside the rear wheel with his hands moving in the dark. Most men would have driven on a lone figure on an empty road at that hour was a thing you did not stop for. And the man wore the heavy leather and the patches that told you exactly what kind of trouble you might be inviting. But Walter had spent his whole life being the person other people drove past, and something in him refused to do the same. He pulled over. He left the engine running and the lights on, and he climbed down with his bad knee complaining, and he asked the man if he needed a hand. The biker looked up. He was enormous, even crouched, with a gray beard knotted at the chin and forearms like bridge cable, and a face that had clearly spent decades teaching people not to ask him questions. He did not answer at first. He just looked at Walter. The way you look at a thing you cannot quite place flat, the man finally said. Sidewalls torn, no patch holds that. Walter nodded. He knew tires. He had changed 1,000 of them on 1,000 bad nights on cars belonging to people who never learned his name. He told the man he had a plug kit and a small compressor in the truck bed and that a torn sidewall was a problem, but that there might be a way to limp it to the next town if they packed the tier right and kept the speed down. The biker said nothing, which Walter took for permission. They worked for an hour on that shoulder. The two of them, a janitor and an outlaw, while the highway stayed empty and the stars wheeled overhead. Walter fetched the plug kit from a coffee can behind the seat. The can he kept everything in, and he set his old drop light on the guardrail and angled it down at the wheel, and the little circle of yellow it threw was the only made thing for 9 miles in any direction. The biker held the bike steady by the bars while Walter worked, and neither of them talked much, because there was nothing to say, and both of them knew it. Walter did the careful work, the patient work, because patience was the only thing he had ever been rich in. He cleaned the tear with a rag and a little gasoline. He reamed it until the rubber took the tool clean. He worked the plug in slow and steady, twisting it the way you twist a thing you do not want to tear further, and he sealed it and aired the tire by hand with a small compressor whining off the truck battery, watching the gauge, feeling for the give. Twice he stopped and pressed his thumb against the patch and held his breath and listened for the hiss that would mean he had failed. Twice there was no hiss. The biker watched all of it without a word, the way a man watches another man do a thing well, and somewhere in that hour the wariness went out of him. Though Walter did not notice it go, he never asked the man his name. He never asked what the patches meant, or where the man was headed, or what business sent him down a dead road at midnight. He just fixed the tire, and when it held, he wiped his hands on a rag and said the man should take it slow into Hollis Junction and get the casing replaced come morning. The biker stood. He was a full head taller than Walter, and the night seemed smaller. With him standing in it, he reached into his cut and pulled out a fold of bills, more money than Walter made in 2 weeks, and he held it out. Walter did not take it. "You'd have done it for me," Walter said, though he had no idea whether that was true. "Just take it slow." For a long moment, the biker said nothing. Then he put the money away, and he looked at Walter with an expression that did not belong on a face like that, and he asked the only question of the night that mattered. "What's your name, Walter?" he said. "Walter Boyd." The man nodded once, slow, like he was filing it somewhere permanent. He swung a leg over the bike, and the engine caught and settled into a low idle that Walter felt in his sternum. He did not say, "Thank you." Men like that do not say, "Thank you." Instead, he said something Walter would turn over in his mind for the next 11 years. "A debt like this doesn't expire, Walter Boyd. You won't see it coming. But it'll come." Then he was gone, taillight, shrinking down the dark road, and Walter stood alone on the shoulder with grease on his hands, and no idea that he had just changed the last decade of his life. He told no one. Who would he have told? Walter Boyd lived alone in a single wide on the edge of the same town he had been born in, a town that had slowly emptied of everything but the work that nobody else wanted. His wife had passed 9 years before that night on the highway, and they had never managed children, and the few friends he once had were either dead or moved away or simply lost in the long gray erosion that takes a man's people one at a time, until he wakes up one day and realizes the phone never rings. Walter had made his peace with that, or he had told himself he had. There is a difference, and Walter knew it, but it was a difference he had stopped examining. So he went back to his life. He mopped the floors of the Meridian County Community Center 5 nights a week, the long fluorescent hours after the last basketball league cleared out, and the building belonged only to him and the hum of the machines. He emptied the trash, and he scrubbed the locker rooms, and he buffed the gym floor until it threw back the lights. And he did it all with a care that nobody noticed because nobody was there to notice. He fixed what broke before anyone reported it broken. He knew which doors stuck and which pipes knocked, and which kid had carved his initials into the 3rd bleacher in 1987. The building was his in the way that things become yours when you are the only one who tends them. The years went the way. Years go for a man like that. Quiet, unremarkable, the kind of life that leaves no mark on the world and asks for none. And then, 11 years on, the phone in the break room rang at 4 in the morning. Walter knew the voice the instant it spoke. You do not forget a voice like that, low and grinding as gravel under a boot, even across more than a decade. It told him not to come in that Friday, to wear something clean, to leave the shed unlocked, and that something was owed. And Walter, who had told himself he wanted nothing from anyone, found that his hands were shaking when he set the receiver down. He almost did not believe it. He half decided it was a prank, or a wrong number, or the kind of dream a tired old man has at the end of a long shift. But the voice had used his name. His full name, Walter Boyd. And it had spoken of a debt. And there was only one debt in Walter's whole life that a man like that could mean. The trouble was that Walter was retiring. He had not told the voice that, because the voice had hung up before Walter could say anything at all, but it was true. After 19 years at the community center, Walter had handed in his notice. Because his knee had finally given out for good, and the doctor in town had used a word Walter did not like and would not repeat. His last shift was that Friday. The Friday, the voice had told him not to come in. And the center director, a brisk and kindly woman named Pam Esposito, who ran the building like a tight ship and had a soft spot for the old man who never complained, had insisted on throwing him a small retirement party in the main hall. Coffee and a sheet cake and a few folding chairs. Walter had begged her not to. He hated being looked at, but Pam had insisted, and Walter had not had the energy to fight a woman who meant well. So there were two things happening that Friday, and Walter could not see how they fit together, and the not knowing sat in his chest like a stone all week long. He thought about calling in the favor he did not understand. He thought about asking Pam to cancel the party. He thought about a dozen things and did none of them because that was the kind of man he was, and instead he simply waited, the way he had waited for everything his whole life, and he wore something clean on Friday, like the voice had told him to, and he left the shed unlocked. And he drove his rusted truck to the community center one last time, with no earthly idea what was coming. What was coming was already in motion, and had been for weeks, in rooms Walter would never see. The man whose tire he had fixed was named Dutch Mallory, though almost no one called him that anymore. For 30 years he had been the president of a motorcycle club called the Iron Saints, a charter that ran a long stretch of two-lane country and answered to a code older than any of the men who carried it. Dutch was not a sentimental man. He had buried more brothers than he could comfortably count, and he had a reputation earned over a hard life for never forgetting a slight and never forgiving a betrayal. But the code the Iron Saints lived by cut both ways. It remembered cruelty, and it remembered kindness. And for 11 years, Dutch Mallory had carried the memory of a tired old man on a dead highway who fixed his tire in the dark and would not take his money and asked for nothing at all. Dutch had looked for him quietly over the years in the way a man looks for something he is in no hurry to find but cannot quite let go. He knew the name, Walter Boyd, and he knew the stretch of road, and that was enough eventually for a club with patient eyes everywhere. They found him in Meridian County. They learned about the single wide and the night shifts and the wife 9 years gone. And they learned 3 weeks before that Friday that Walter Boyd was retiring and that no one was coming to market but a sheet cake and a handful of folding chairs. That was when Dutch made the call. But the favor Walter could not see was not only about a party, because in those same 3 weeks, the Iron Saints had learned something else about Meridian County, something that turned a simple debt into something with teeth. The community center, where Walter had spent 19 years, sat on 4 acres of land at the edge of town. And that land had become valuable in the quiet way that land becomes valuable when nobody is looking. A development firm out of the city had been buying up the dead blocks around it, parcel by parcel, and the community center was the last piece they needed. The trouble was that the center was public land deeded to the county for the people of the county, and it could not simply be sold. It had to be condemned first, declared unfit, a liability. And there was a man on the county board willing to do exactly that, for a price. A man named Garrett Vance. Walter had met Garrett Vance exactly once, and had disliked him on sight, though he could not have said why beyond the man's shoes. Vance was the kind of official who wore a suit that cost more than Walter's truck, and a watch that cost more than the suit, and who walked through a public building like he was deciding what to throw away. He had come through the center 2 months before with a clipboard and an engineer and a smile that never reached his eyes, and he had taken photographs of every crack in the foundation and every rust stain on every pipe. And Walter, mopping in the corner, had heard him use words like deferred maintenance and structural risk and unsalvageable. Walter had known the way you know whether that the man was building a case. He had mentioned it to Pam, and Pam had gone pale because Pam had heard the rumors too. What neither Walter nor Pam knew was that the development firm Garrett Vance was quietly working for had 2 years earlier paved over a different piece of land 40 miles east, a piece of land that held a small roadside chapel and a strip of grass where the Iron Saints buried their dead. They had bulldozed it for a parking lot. They had not asked. And the man who signed the permit that let them do it, the county official who took the envelope and looked the other way, was the same man now standing over Walter Boyd's community center with a clipboard and a smile. Garrett Vance. The Iron Saints had a long memory, and now they had a name, a place, and a Friday. Walter knew none of this when he pulled into the community center parking lot that Friday afternoon. He knew only that the lot was strangely full, and that Pam met him at the door with a look he could not read, half excitement and half worry, and that she steered him toward the main hall with her hand on his elbow, saying, come on, everyone's waiting," in a voice that was trying too hard to be cheerful. Everyone, it turned out, was more people than Walter had expected. The folding chairs were full. There were faces he recognized from 19 years of nodding hellos, the morning swim crowd and the youth league coaches and the women from the quilting circle and the old men who played cards in the back room on Tuesdays. They had come. For him, Walter stood in the doorway of the hall. He had mopped 1,000 times and felt his throat close, because in all his careful calculations about that Friday, he had never once allowed himself to imagine that anyone would come at all. There was a banner. There was the sheet cake Pam had promised, white with blue letters. There was a folding table of coffee in paper cups. And there was Garrett Vance, standing near the front in his expensive suit, because of course he was, because the county board had sent him to say a few official words about the retiring employee and the bright future of the facility, words Walter would later understand were the opening move. Vance shook Walter's hand with a grip that was all surface. He said something about decades of dedicated service. He said something about the community's gratitude. He said the word legacy. And he smiled the smile that never reached his eyes, and Walter understood that this man did not know his name and did not care to, and was already thinking about the bulldozers. Pam stood and tapped a plastic spoon against a paper cup, and the room quieted, and she began to talk about Walter, about the 19 years, about the way the floors always shone, and the way nothing ever stayed broken, and the way Mr. Boyd had been the heart of the building, even though most people had never thought to thank him for it. And Walter stood there in his clean shirt, with his hands folded in front of him, looking at the floor he had buffed, feeling more seen than he had felt in a decade, and trying not to think about a phone call at 4 a.m. that had told him to leave the shed unlocked. That was when they heard it. It started as a low vibration, almost below hearing, a thing you felt in the floorboards before you understood it as sound. Then it grew. It became a rumble and then a roar and then a thunder that rattled the windows in their frames and stopped Pam mid-sentence, with the plastic spoon still raised in her hand. Every head in the room turned toward the tall windows that looked out over the parking lot. Motorcycles. Dozens of them. A river of chrome and black leather pouring into the lot in a slow, disciplined formation, headlights cutting through the gray afternoon, engines throttling down one by one until they stood in ranks across the asphalt like a wall. Walter counted without meaning, till he lost count somewhere past 40. They kept coming. They filled the lot and spilled onto the grass and lined the road out front, and the riders dismounted in a silence that was somehow louder than the engines had been, and they came toward the building in a body, leather and gray beards and patches. And at the front of them all walked a giant of a man with a knotted gray beard and forearms like bridge cable, 11 years older but unmistakable. The room had gone dead silent. The quilting women had frozen. The youth coaches stood with their coffee halfway to their mouths. And Garrett Vance, near the front in his expensive suit, had gone the color of paper. The doors opened. Dutch Mallory walked in, and behind him came his brothers, more of them than the hall could hold, until they ringed the walls of the room too deep, and the air itself seemed to change pressure. Dutch did not look at Pam. He did not look at the banner, or the cake, or the county official in his fine suit. He crossed the room with the whole weight of attention following him, and he stopped in front of Walter Boyd, and the old janitor looked up at the man whose tire he had fixed on a dead highway 11 years before. "Hello, Walter," Dutch said. His voice was exactly as Walter remembered it, low, grinding, certain. "You came," Walter said. It was all he could manage. "Told you I would." Dutch looked at him a long moment, and something moved behind the hard eyes. A debt like this doesn't expire. Then the big man did a thing that no one in that room would ever forget. He reached up, slow and deliberate, and he removed the patch from over his own heart, the small rectangular patch that named him, and he held it out to Walter Boyd in his open palm. Behind him, 60 men stood at something close to attention, and the meaning of the gesture, though Walter did not yet have the words for it, ran through the room like a current. This was not a thank you. This was a declaration. This was a man telling the world, in the only language his life had given him, that Walter Boyd was under the protection of the Iron Saints, that an injury to him was an injury to all of them, that anyone who meant the old man harm would now have to come through 60 brothers to reach him. Walter took the patch with hands that would not stay steady. He did not understand all of it, but he understood enough to feel the floor shift beneath 19 years of being the man everyone drove past. And it was right then, into that charged and reverent silence, that Garrett Vance made the worst decision of his life. He cleared his throat, and he stepped forward with his clipboard, smile reassembling itself on his face, and he said, in the smooth, official voice of a man who had never once in his life faced a consequence, "Well, this is quite a turnout. Gentlemen, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to clear the lot. There are county ordinances about gatherings on public property, and I'm here in an official capacity to." He did not finish the sentence. Dutch Mallory turned around. He turned slowly, the way a mountain would turn if a mountain could, and he looked at Garrett Vance for the first time, and recognition moved across the big man's weathered face like a shadow crossing a field, because Dutch knew that face. He had spent 2 years learning that face. It was the face on the permit. It was the face that had signed away the chapel and the strip of grass where his brothers were buried, and taken an envelope to do it, and never lost a night's sleep. "County capacity," Dutch said. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. "You're Garrett Vance." The official's smile flickered. "I'm sorry, Dewey. 40 miles east," Dutch said. 2 years ago, Maple Ridge Road. There was a chapel there, and a little piece of ground behind it with a fence around it." He took one step closer, Vance took one step back, and the dance of it told the whole room everything. "You signed the permit that let them pave it. You took money to do it. Some of those graves were ours. The color that had drained from Vance's face now drained from his whole body. He looked suddenly like a man who has heard a sound in the dark of his own house. I don't know what you're saying. Those were routine zoning approvals. The paperwork was all in order. I can't be expected to know every detail. Every grave you paved over, Dutch finished. No, you can't be expected to know that. That's the thing about men like you, Vance. You never have to know. He let the silence sit. Then he gestured, almost lazily, toward a younger member who had come in behind the wall of leather. A lean man with quick eyes and a tablet under his arm. The young man stepped forward and set the tablet on the coffee table beside the abandoned sheet cake, and he turned it so the room could see, and what was on the screen made Garrett Vance go very still. It was not violence. The Iron Saints did not deal in the kind of violence Vance was braced for, the kind that left marks a man could take to a hospital in a courtroom. What they dealt in, when the situation called for it, was the truth, assembled patiently and laid out where it could not be unseen. The screen showed documents, bank transfers. A shell company with Garrett Vance's wife's maiden name on the paperwork, emails between Vance and the development firm, dated and time-stamped, discussing the community center, discussing the word condemnation, discussing the figure that would change hands once the land was declared unfit and quietly sold. It showed the same firm's name on the Maple Ridge permit 2 years before. It showed a pattern. It showed a man who had made a long, comfortable career out of selling the things that belonged to people who could not fight back. Pam Esposito made a small sound and put her hand over her mouth. The youth coaches leaned in. The quilting women who missed nothing read every line. "That's confidential," Vance said, and his voice had gone thin and high. That's illegally obtained. None of that would ever hold up. You can't just do this." "We're not a court," Dutch said. "We don't need it to hold up. We just need everyone in this room to see it." He looked around the hall, at the swim crowd and the coaches and the card players and the woman who ran the building, at all the ordinary people of Meridian County who had come to thank an old man for 19 years of quiet work. "These are the people you were going to sell out from under. This is the building you called unsalvageable. And this is the man," he said, turning back to Walter, "who kept it standing for 19 years while you were figuring out how to knock it down." Garrett Vance looked at the room. He looked at the faces, every one of them now turned toward him, and he saw in them the thing he had spent his whole life avoiding, which was the moment of being known. There was no badge that would help him here, and no board, no firm, no envelope, no county capacity. The institutional armor he had worn his whole life had not been stripped away by force. It had simply been shown to be paper in a room full of people who could now see straight through it. He tried, once more, to find the official voice. "I'll have your charters investigated," he said. "Every one of you. I'll have this whole circus shut down." "You'll do nothing," Dutch said. And now, finally, there was iron in it. Because the moment you make a single call, every document on that screen goes to the state attorney, to the newspaper, to every family whose name is in those graves. You go home, Vance. You resign your seat on Monday, citing health. You never touch this land or these people again, and you spend the rest of your comfortable life knowing that 60 men know exactly who you are. He paused. "That's the deal. It's the only one you're getting. And it's a great deal more mercy than you showed anyone at Maple Ridge." For a moment, Garrett Vance simply stood there, and the room watched the calculation move behind his eyes. the desperate official arithmetic of a man searching for an exit and finding every door closed. Then something in him collapsed. The shoulders came down. The clipboard absurdly slipped from his hand and clattered on the floor that Walter had buffed, and the sound of it was the loudest thing in the room. Vance bent and picked it up with shaking hands, and he did not look at anyone as he straightened, and he walked toward the doors with the careful, unsteady steps of a man whose legs have stopped, fully belonging to him. The wall of leather parted to let him through. Nobody touched him. Nobody said a word. They simply let him walk out into the flat gray afternoon past the river of chrome that filled the lot, past 60 witnesses who would carry his face for the rest of their lives, and into a car that he sat in for a long time before he found the will to start it. When he was gone, the silence in the hall was a different silence than before. The pressure had lifted. And into it, after a moment, Pam Esposito began uncertainly to clap. And then the youth coaches joined her. And then the whole room, the swim crowd and the card players and the quilting women, were on their feet, and the sound rose and filled the hall that Garrett Vance had wanted to bulldoze. And it was not for Vance's leaving. Not entirely. It was for the old man standing dazed at the front, with a club president's patch held in both his hands. Dutch waited for the noise to settle. Then he turned back to Walter, and the hardness was gone from his face, and what was left was something Walter had only seen on it once before, on a dark road 11 years ago. "That land's not going anywhere," Dutch said. "We'll see to the paperwork, the real kind. There's lawyers who owe us favors, too." A ghost of something crossed his face that, on another man, might have been a smile. "Building's safe, Walter. Your building." "It's not my building," Walter said, his voice cracking. "I just cleaned it." "No." Dutch shook his great head slowly. "You kept it. There's a difference." "We know the difference." He looked at the patch in Walter's hands. "That's yours now." "You know what it means?" Walter shook his head. "It means you're not alone anymore," Dutch said. "It means when your knee gives out and you can't make the rent, you call the number on the back of that and a man comes. It means when you're in a hospital bed with nobody in the chair beside you, there'll be somebody in the chair beside you. It means," and here the big man's voice dropped to something almost gentle, "that you'll never again be a man that people drive past. You did the work nobody thanked you for 19 years, for a town that never learned your name. We learned it. We're not going to forget it." Walter Boyd, who had not wept at his own wife's funeral because he had not wanted to make a scene, who had spent a lifetime being careful and quiet and unseen, stood in the middle of the room he had tended for 19 years and wept openly, and not one of the 60 men around him thought any less of him for it. Several of them, if you had looked closely, were not entirely dry-eyed themselves. They stayed. That was the thing Walter would remember most. In the years that followed, they did not deliver their justice and roar away. They stayed for the party. 60 leather-clad outlaws ate sheet cake off paper plates and drank coffee from paper cups and listened to the quilting women tell stories about the old janitor, and they laughed and they shook the hands of the youth coaches. And one enormous man with a chain on his wallet got down on the freshly buffed floor to help a child who had wandered in find a dropped quarter. The community center had never been so full. Pam Esposito went around refilling coffee for men who could have bought the building outright, and she would say later that she had never in her life felt so safe in a room, and Walter sat in the place of honor he had begged not to be given, with a club president's patch in his shirt pocket and a paper plate of cake going untouched in front of him, and he understood slowly the shape of the thing that had happened to him. He had stopped on a dead road for a stranger because he could not stand to be the kind of man who drove past. He had asked for nothing, and the world which had taken his wife and his friends and his years and given him nothing in return but a mop and a quiet trailer at the edge of a dying town, had finally, on the last day of his working life, paid a debt he never knew he was owed. The retirement Walter Boyd had dreaded turned out to be the beginning of the fullest decade of his life. He did not, in the end, spend his last years alone in a single wide. The Iron Saints saw to that in the quiet, practical ways that were the only ways they knew how to love. The number on the back of the patch was real. When his knee finally failed for good and he could not climb the steps of his trailer, two of them showed up on a Saturday with a truckload of lumber and built him a ramp. And they did not ask, and they did not take money. And when Walter protested, the larger of the two looked at him and said the same thing, that a debt like this doesn't expire. And that was the end of the argument. As when a property tax on the trailer crept past what his small pension could cover, the bill was simply paid, by no one Walter could ever pin down, and the county clerk only shrugged when he asked. When he was in the hospital that winter with the pneumonia that nearly took him, he woke in the dark of the ward, and there was a man in the chair beside the bed. A different man each night, reading or dozing or just sitting, so that Walter Boyd never once spent a night in that hospital alone. He woke one of those nights to find the lean man with the quick eyes folded into the small chair, reading a paperback by the light that bled in from the hall, and Walter, fogged with fever, asked him why any of them came, why a club of hard men 40 miles away would take turns sitting in a plastic chair for an old man who had done nothing but fix a tire. The lean man marked his place with his thumb and thought about it a while, the way he thought about everything, and then he said that most people went their whole lives waiting for someone to show up, and that a man who showed up first, who stopped on a dead road when no one was watching and no one would ever know, had earned the showing up of others. He said it plain, the way the club said everything. Then he went back to his book, and Walter lay in the dark and listened to the rain on the window and the quiet turning of the pages, and for the first time in many years he was not afraid of the dark of a long night. He learned their names over those years. He learned that Dutch had lost a son young and never spoke of it. He learned that the lean man with the tablet had a degree he never used and a gift for finding the truth that powerful men preferred to keep buried. He learned the quilting women and the bikers had formed of all things a friendship, and that the Iron Saints clubhouse, 40 miles east now, had a quilt on the wall behind the bar that the women had made, and that no one ever explained it to a newcomer because no explanation would do. He went to the clubhouse himself, sometimes when one of them came to drive him, and he sat in the warm dim of it among the chrome and the leather, an old janitor in a clean shirt. And he was at home there in a way he had not been at home anywhere since his wife died. The community center never did get bulldozed. The land stayed public, the way it was deeded to be, and within a year there was a new sign out front and a small brass plate by the main doors that Pam had insisted on that read simply that the building was maintained for 19 years by Walter Boyd, who kept it standing. Walter complained about the plate. He said it was too much. Why? But he stopped to read it every time he visited, which was often, because the new janitor was a young man Walter had trained himself, and Walter could not quite stay away from the floors he had buffed for 2 decades. Garrett Vance resigned his county seat that Monday, citing health, exactly as he had been told to. He moved away within the year. The development, firm, deprived of its man on the inside, and aware, now that someone was watching, quietly withdrew its interest in Meridian County and was never heard from there again. And the strip of grass at Maple Ridge, 40 miles east, where the chapel had stood, became, through a long, patient effort that Walter only half understood, a thing the Iron Saints had wanted back for 2 years. Dutch never told Walter the details, but there was a Sunday that spring when a column of motorcycles rode out to Maple Ridge with an old janitor riding in the cab of a truck at the front of them, and there were words said over the reclaimed ground, and Walter understood that the debt the club had paid to him and the debt it had collected from Vance were, in the end, the same debt. The same code, the same long memory that did not let kindness go unanswered or cruelty go unmarked. Walter Boyd lived another 9 years. He died in his sleep, in his own bed in the trailer with the ramp, on a quiet night in early autumn, and he did not die alone, because there was a man in the chair beside the bed, the way there had been a man in the chair every night he needed one for 9 years. The funeral was not small. The whole town came. The swim crowd and the card players and the quilting women and Pam Esposito spoke and could barely finish. And out beyond them all, lining the road from the little chapel to the grave, stood 60 men in leather, gray now, some of them, and fewer than there had been. But there, every one of them, standing in the cold autumn light with their heads bowed for an old janitor who had once stopped on a dead road for a stranger and asked for nothing. Dutch Mallory was the last to leave. He stood a long while at the graveside after the others had gone, a giant of a man grown old, and he set something down in the turned earth, a small worn patch with a name on it, and he said a few words that no one was close enough to hear. Then he climbed onto his bike, and the engine caught and settled into the low idle that Walter had felt in his sternum on a dead highway 30 years before, and he rode away west into the falling light. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that the smallest kindness can outlast a whole lifetime and come back when you least expect it, take a moment to sit with that feeling and carry it into whatever quiet road you travel next. There are Walter Boyds all around us, the people we drive past, the ones who keep things standing while no one is watching. Maybe today you stop. Thank you for listening.